Well, thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. As you know, we are here for the launch of a book on Nasty Women Talk Back. You probably, like myself, were curious. Why would people embrace nastiness? I recently bought a book for my granddaughter about rebel women. And one of the questions I was asked by some guy at the bookshop was, who am I buying the book for? And I was saying I'm buying the book for a five-month-old child. And you wanted to know, why on earth would you want her to be a rebel? But here we have 4 of 29 authors of Nasty Women Talk Back. And the authors with us are Professor Amanda Gouws, sitting next to me. Rebecca Davis, sorry. Rebecca Davis, Joy Watson, and Ashanti Kunene. Firstly, congratulations on a job well done.
Thank you.
But what's up with the heads? Do you want to tell us? Rebecca, why the heads? Okay.
Well, good evening, and thank you for coming. This is such a privilege. I'm an academic, and normally when you launch an academic book, you have 10 people in the audience. So this to me is wonderful. The title refers to when Trump and Hillary Clinton were having these debates during the election campaigns. He called her a nasty woman. And so during the march, the anti-Trump march after he became president, the global women marches, they all wore these pink pussy hats. So we thought we'll put it on the front page and we'll title the book Nasty Women Talk Back. Because if Clinton was a nasty woman, then all of those who are feminists are nasty women. So we have... So that's the reference to the title and to the hats. And Joy?
Well, we thought also that it's a good photo moment, so... and also, we look good in pink. But Ashanti's is under the chair, just so that you know, in case you were wondering.
I have to be prepared to be wearing pussy hats out in public, guys.
She's complaining that we didn't send her the memo.
You need to give me forewarning or something.
Well, it would appear that we have 3 nasty women and 1 rebel woman. Right. Well, thank you for clarifying that. Somewhere in the book, you do say that nasty women are women who talk back to patriarchy. And because that was the context in which Hillary was busy explaining policies in a very rational and clear way, and the response from her opponent was, what a nasty woman. And there was no correlation between what she had just said and the response that says, what a nasty woman. But before we get into the gist of things, though, I wondered whether you would like to be called nasty women. I know that with black people, we call each other blackies, but you don't want white people to call you, not blackies, darkies. And, yeah, but you don't want white people to call you darkies. And American blacks call each other niggers, but they don't want white people to call them niggers. So would you want men to start calling us nasty women?
I mean, well, I think men call us whatever they want anyway, so...
So you're inviting them to call us nasty women?
No, I think it's just also reclaiming of words that are meant to hurt you or put you down. The same thing with slut or hoe or bitch. These are words that especially we talk about 4th wave feminism now, the latest generation. We call each other those things as a way to reclaim that these are not words that are supposed to be derogatory or put us down or meant to hurt us, and that when a man uses it, it's lost its meaning.
So basically, it's about appropriating these labels in order to take away their bite. And I think that's what the women marches did after the Trump thing. I'm going to ask each of you to just briefly indicate what inspired you to embark on this project personally. And I'm going to start with you, Amanda, and to tell us what's the relevance of this book and the experiences that you have shared in this book for the average South African woman.
Thank you for that question. I think I need to say that this was a collective project, so it was a collective, the idea that came to us collectively. The third person who was part of that original moment of the idea, Renette Taljaard Kotardu, is not here tonight, but we were, and you will read this in the introduction, we were having lunch at her home and we were talking about, it was just after Trump was elected as president, and we were really actually quite devastated. So we talked about that, and the thing that sort of we thought about is here we are in South Africa, but we felt like we had a personal stake in what happened in the United States. And it was that moment of hope that for the first time you would have a woman president in the United States. And even though not all people may agree that Hillary was the right candidate, but it was a moment of hope that there would be, for the first time in the empire, a woman. And if you think about the fact that the United States, if we take into consideration that we now have quota systems in many countries that actually get women into government, the United States does not have one, and they have 17% women in government, which is one of the lowest in the world. So we were sort of consoling ourselves with this very bad outcome, and then Renette started to talk about the posters in the marches. And the idea was born. We said, well, why don't we make a collective project, a writing project, and write about the slogans on the posters? And you can carry on from there.
So,
yes, before you continue, Joy, just you can augment that answer, but I also will have one specific question for you about women being scrutinized more than men, because that's what you jointly say in the introduction. But you can maybe augment Amanda's question.
So I think that this moment in time of the global women's marches became a mirror into our own contextual, localized experience. And I think that, you know, for many of us, when we look at the period immediately after the transition to democratic governance, we were all caught up in the euphoria of the democratic project. And what we saw happen then, of course, was that feminists had worked very hard to craft a women's charter, to have gender and women's rights and gender rights inserted in very bold terms in the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. We saw that they fought for the state machinery that would take up gender issues. And I think that, you know, we saw many politicians go into the state of being our public representatives, expecting them to take up these issues, that they were progressive enough to understand this agenda and to take it on. We also saw feminists be absorbed into the state bureaucracy. And so, you know, there was a period of thinking, we've arrived and this thing is happening. And of course, 23 years later, you know, notwithstanding the fact that we have seen some gains, most of which is some very progressive rights-based legislation, that while we have this legislation, what in a sense they've become is a set of paper tigers where they exist, but very significantly the lives of many women, and very specifically black women in this country, have not changed. So they're the face of poverty. We still have manifest gender-based violence in our homes, in our public spaces. And so what does this rights-based framework mean for women 23 years down the line? Very little. We see the political landscape having changed in ways which alienates those who seek to push transformatory agendas, and a shutting down of spaces for progressive engagement. And I think that, you know, in our context, it was the sense of how what was happening globally inspired a deep-seated sense of rage that we had expected and we had fought for so much more. And we are in a context right now where, you know, we are fighting things like a traditional courts bill, where just recently a gender equality clause was taken out. So there seems to have been a pulling back of some of the gains that had been, and these were hard-won gains. So it's almost as if that we're at a moment in time where we need to sit back and reflect and say, what is going on and why? And how do we reclaim this project of claiming rights and the discourse of promoting gender equity, and without relying too much on the state?
Well, thank you, Joy. Because of your response, I'm going to jump the question I'm going to ask you so that we can develop the response a little bit more. And for that, I'm going to go to Ashanti and say, Joy is saying the commentary on what happened in America is meant to give us an opportunity to reflect on what's happening at home. And she's giving us examples of where she feels that we've taken a couple of steps back. But in the book, you say that women are the ones who inculcate a culture of patriarchy, and they're the ones who enforce. As mothers, as other women, when they see other women stepping out of line, they're the ones who force other women to step into line. If that's true, who then is to blame for where we are? And what's your hope in writing this book? What do you hope can be done to help women not to be part of entrenching patriarchy?
I mean, I think when you talk about blame, we are all participants of the system. We upheld it, we allow the men, we allow the women to slut shame. We are all to blame for the state of affairs, right? And my hope for the peace, I think for me, Trump's election, one, made my international relations degree completely irrelevant because he was never supposed to be president. That's not how things go. That's not what they taught us, right? So now my degree is out the window. Okay.
Oh my God.
But the hope is that Trump forces us to have difficult conversations, like white supremacy. Like it forces us to have conversations about racism and about gender inequality, like actual hard, honest conversations, because it's a thing of, so this is where we're at as people. This is the most powerful man in the world is Donald J. Trump, and we're okay with that. Is that what we're saying? And if the answer to that is no, that means that we need to start having different conversations, start doing different things. Different inputs result in different outputs. We need to change our society. We need to change the world. We have to be better than our parents and our grandparents. We need to stop saying yes, pass. We need to stop this apathy. We actually need to get angry about this is the state of society. Because for me, I think it was also a chat of, hey man, I'm supposedly born free, and I'm having the same conversations that my parents were having when they were my age, and the same things that my grandmother was having when she was my age. There needs to be progress. I refuse to have children only for them to be having the same conversations we're having today. That doesn't make any sense in my head. So.
Well, thank you, Ashanti. Rebecca, in the book you say you're tired of mediocre men running things.
Yes.
And having said that, Ashanti in the book says it was primarily women, the women's vote, that gave Americans the president they have today.
And that's a really
So
troubling...
how do you relate the two?
It's a really troubling reality. I think there's no political group who this applies to more so than women. There's no political group that colludes as enthusiastically in their own oppression as women, I don't think. And I mean that in a whole range of ways. But I just wanted to to start by saying something that I think will come up in question time anyway, which is that this is this moment in America. Why are we worried about it in South Africa? And I think that in South Africa we have this tendency, particularly lately, of adopting debates wholesale from the West due to the internet in ways that sometimes make much less sense in a South African context, and particularly when it comes to identity politics. So for instance, race discussions in America are based around minority rights, because black people in America are a minority. They are not a minority in South Africa, even though many of the same strains are still there. And even the Me Too movement, I mean, I think there was a sense in the West that for many of the people exposed to this hashtag, suddenly a real sense of genuine horror and alarm that men in power had been abusing their position, often to the extent of, criminal sexual violence. We had a president who went to trial for rape. I don't believe there's anyone in South Africa who could have read the Me Too hashtag and been like, that's happening? That's a bit crazy. So from that perspective, I think we should sometimes be skeptical about the way we take on America and Europe's debates about identity politics. But in this sense, why I personally felt so enraged and disillusioned and terribly, terribly sad about Trump's election was because I really think there was something so universal in that experience for women of the notion of this totally ill-equipped man being rewarded with this position of power. I really think that that is something that so many women in this audience and outside can relate to, having seen, male colleagues promoted above them, or just the way in society men receive more space to talk, to act, to spread themselves physically, that there's something about that. There's something about that which I think is a really relatable human experience, and not just an American one. Sorry, Thuli, you look like you're about to say something. I don't want to cut you off. I'm quite scared of you.
Okay. Now, I'm supposed to talk back at patriarchy, not at you. So we're on the same page, okay? Right. No, but whilst you're going on that, I wanted you to help answer the question, why do women collude?
Well, it's beneficial in many ways for anyone to collude in a situation with your oppressor, in terms of it's often how you get ahead. Well, I think there are a couple of reasons, honestly. One is that determining whether you collude in oppression or fight it often comes down simply to personality variables. It really does, in terms of, are you psychologically the kind of person who's likely to rebel, to react, or simply to go with the flow? Sometimes people, for whatever reasons, are just more likely to want a quiet life, to collude. Then there's factors like religion. In this country, we know that overwhelmingly women are more religious than men, and it's an overwhelmingly religious Christian country. And there are ways in which the way Christianity is understood and practiced in this country perpetrates patriarchy. So if you are an adherent of that faith, you're also more likely as a woman, arguably, in many contexts, to go along with oppression. And then there's the factors of education, there's the factors of what you're picking up through socialization and the media in terms of what is normalized in the sense. So it's hard to blame women for certain types of collusion, because we're only perpetrating a certain kind of injustice then. But the kind that Ashanti was talking about, for instance, where women slut shame, etc., that's a bit harder to forgive in the sense that, you're directly taking on women, and the only advantage that you receive from that, I would suggest, is sort of by playing into respectability politics more than other women.
But on that,
Right. Please. Sorry, perhaps our colleague at the back is going to do that.
We're only women.
Ashanti, did you want to say something in response to Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, for me, an example of the collusion, is what happened with the ANC Women's League and Crazy, and the example that you said. That, for me, was the clearest example of when you talk about now collusion. You were supposed to, I don't know, just as a young person looking at that, how do you now even begin to talk respectability politics with the women from the ANC Women's League who did what they did to Crazy? Yeah.
But walking in their shoes, on August 9, at the THEMBE Foundation, we adopted the theme, in her shoes to try and understand both the women who criticize and the women who are criticized. I suspect you have written this book because you want to change things.
I mean, we should hope.
So,
We should hope.
and I would like to ask Joy and Amanda the question around the women who collude. And Rebecca has given us a lot of reasons, and you've given us some. But one of them that struck a chord with me is women wanting some semblance of peace, wanting to exist in a life where there's no turbulence. And therefore, if you shake things, they feel that things are going to be terrible for them as well. For example, in a home where your father is a bully, nobody wants to see anybody who's going to do something that's going to spark that bulliness of the father. So to the extent, if that's true, that women who are complicit in their own oppression are just trying to steady things a bit, what will this book do, or what will the conversations you hope to take place around this book do to change things?
Well, I think feminism has, as its praxis, raising consciousness. So if you look at the authors, they're from all over the world, and they're all in their localized context experiencing something. We have refugees who have gone through the most terrible experiences of being stateless citizens who can't cross borders, who sit in a camp every day. And yet find something that they can actually relate to as women. So it is about speaking from a position, a contextual position as women who are experiencing, I think, in this specific historic moment, the rise of right-wing populism, that it's a global moment and it's taking us back and rolling back the gains that we've made. So the book speaks to this specific historic moment, but it also speaks to every localized context. And I think whether it's a man or a woman reading this book will be able to relate to our common humanity that speaks through the very personal and intimate stories in the essays in this book. So it is about raising consciousness, and it's also about hope. That we shouldn't see Trump as this moment that we can't get past. That there is something more, and that it is, I think, women, but it is women with a feminist consciousness who really will make the difference. You know, the ones who understand the collusion, who can take the step back. I mean, Ashanti's essay is beautiful. She says, don't forget, white women voted for Trump, right? So we have to think about the fact, right? So it is about that raising of consciousness and how we can relate or actually take that step back and say, well, I never thought about it in this way. And now, you know, in my own essay, I use Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence. Rob Nixon writes about how we are actually destroying the environment and what it means. But the way I use it is to say it's the slow violence of denying our common humanity, the slow violence of silencing us, the slow violence of taking things away. Yeah. So it's about trying to create or create a context in which each and everyone who reads the book can get something out of it.
And maybe just
thank you, Amanda.
to also shift the conversation a bit away from women who collude to the fact that what we see is a systemic thing. This is a gendered social order within which we all operate. And so, you know, when we talk about sexism and women colluding, it's not women who designed that system. So there is institutionalized sexism, a system that is intact, that manifests and impacts upon us at every level and every aspect of our lives. And when we talk about the creating peace, as you were saying, that, you know, it took me a while to sort of come into a space of comfort with this, that there's a time for peace and there's a time for militancy, and that no significant gains in terms of radically transforming our society were made by sitting on the status quo. So if we look at the significant gains that feminism has given us, and we look at the right to same-sex relationships, the rights to termination of pregnancy, those were hard-won gains that were made and came about as a result of radical thought and action. And so there are moments when we have to enter into spaces of radical thought and action and being comfortable in the discomfort that that brings. And it's a hard thing to sit with, because we come from a very conflictual, violent past, and we saying that there's a time for militancy and for being angry and taking issues up very vociferously and vehemently.
Thank you. Basically, yeah. I think Amanda was giving us a sense that the book tells stories of different women's experiences, from those who have been pussy grabbed to those who have experienced the indignity of forced immigration and the difficulties of trying to move on in that context. Problems in the workplace and all sorts of things. And you are saying, okay, moving beyond women's complicity, the relevance to our own situation is looking at what is the state of patriarchy in South Africa, basically. In summary, what is the state? And then moving with that theme about what is the state of patriarchy, and your theme about we need to be conscious. Joy, you said something, in your whole story is about pussies are not for grabbing. And then you talk about your own experience with pussy grabbing. In the main book, where you talk, your introduction says that women, or rather, Americans chose to elect a misogynist who boasts about grabbing the pussies of women, but they still went ahead and elected that person. What parallels do we have here in South Africa? You raised a little bit the story of Kwezi. So, but what other parallels do we have that confront us on a day-to-day basis that we actually need to deal with going forward?
Wow. I mean, for me, it's the precedent you're setting, right? You're basically telling young boys that it doesn't matter how you behave or what you do, you can still become president of a country. It doesn't matter if you sexually molest a fellow student at varsity, you will be protected, you'll still graduate. We will make the university, for fear of reputation, will make sure that you finish your degree, and you as the victim will still have to go to attend class with the person that molested you, because the university convinced you to not go to the police station, but to deal with it internally so that they can better manage reputation. It's the precedent we set. It's a crisis of leadership that results from the lack of consequences for the abuse of phallic power. The abuse of phallic power, there is no consequence, whether socially, whether financially, whether reputationally, for any of it. And that, for me, is a problem.
So, this is, I'm glad you've raised this issue on varsity sexual violence, and because it's become a big issue in South Africa. And a few weeks ago, we had a young woman even take her own life after having been raped. But moving also from varsity life, and the link you've made very clearly that it takes being condoned, having all of those acts being condoned at that young stage for you to move through life believing that you can use your phallic power any way you want and still get away with it in society. But let's look at South African politics. Around the same time as Americans were dealing with their own presidency race, we had our own issues here. What parallels at that high level do we have here that South African women need to grapple with? Anyone who wants to deal with it.
So I think it's interesting that's what you said about the presidential race, because we can't forget that round about the same time we had Clinton going against Trump, we also had the opportunity to elect our first women president, or rather the ANC did, in the form of Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. And it's interesting that many of us who, you know, would on Facebook, for instance, profess to be big Clinton fans, would not at all have been enthused actually about Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma as South Africa's first president, and for a variety of reasons. But there was never a sense that the notion of South Africa electing a first female president would become about that gender moment in the same way that it was the case in the US at all, really. And part of that is due to the ANC itself, frankly, and we saw that most absurdly in the ANC Women's League, who first of all actively obstructed other female candidates from running against Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, including, you know, insulting the likes of Lindiwe Sisulu, Baleka Mbete, and so forth. And then when Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma was not elected, turned around and cried sexism, said, you know, why didn't you support this woman? And it was pointed out, well, why didn't you rally behind all female candidates? Why didn't you say, let's get behind Lindiwe Sisulu as well? So I think that there was definitely, in that situation, there was a sense to which our internal party politics are still so fractured along those lines in a way that, you know, there doesn't seem to be any sense of a coherent gender movement in that sense,
Just one last straight question to all of you. Do we have misogyny or misogynistic statements made by senior politicians in South Africa? And do we tolerate those?
Yes, yes and yes.
Yes.
Short answer.
Yes and yes.
We do.
You know, I think that that what has been interesting for me is that we've seen in the wake of #MeToo the series of stories that was exposed about sexual harassment and sexual violence in the NGO sector. And we saw, you know, as a consequence of this, the very open, honest discussions that this sector is having in and amongst itself to deal with very difficult issues. And in some ways, you know, while I think that that is absolutely necessary, I had moments of sitting back and thinking, why are we so shocked that this is happening in the NGO sector? Just because they work on social justice does not mean that there's a different standard. Sexual violence happens everywhere. It's not a shock that it's happening in a space that is meant to promote social justice. So, but the thing is, why is it that in some ways, and maybe this is just my perception, that we've been less tolerant of that than when it happens in the public domain and amongst very senior political leaders who carry on in political office, and there isn't the same sense of uproar? Well, to some extent, certainly there is, but I think possibly it is about that in the face of this, we're so fatigued. It's like, oh my God, again, is this really happening? And nothing's being done, and then we get a sorry story about, oh, it's investigated and it's swept under a carpet. Is it the fatigue in the face of institutionalized power that makes us respond differently? Because we certainly have been a lot more vigilant in other spaces in taking this up.
Thank you, Joy. You have a minute. I'm supposed to now go to the audience. In the event, you have some quick questions or comments for our authors.
I'll be quick. I also want to say that the book speaks to the North-South power differential. And I mean, the hashtag end rape culture happened here before #MeToo, but it didn't make a ripple anywhere else. But when it happens in the North, we're all, you know, overwhelmed by the #MeToo, but we've already had that moment here. And we had that moment when young women students took to the streets topless to say, this is enough, right?
Thank you, Amanda. Maybe that would be a question for the panelists to say, do we perhaps, in our own curating of the public narrative, perhaps take Western occurrences and centralize our dialogue on that? Is it perhaps maybe our own fault or not? Something that I would like you to think about and say, when we think about feminism, for example, do we ever think about the feminism of Olive Schreiner, Charlotte Maxeke, or are we always looking at what happened in the West and forget what happened here? Because maybe we might find different wisdom from what happened here. There we go, audience. It's your time to make comments and give us quick questions for our authors. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Just maybe one question per person. Your name and I have you, ma'am, and you. I'm going to take 3 questions, and you, ma'am. Right. To you, ma'am.
We can hear you.
Do we have a mic? Right.
I'm Philabi, and I just want to know what you were saying, Joy, about militancy. Okay, there we go. All right, Philabi, that's the name. So Joy, what you were saying about militancy, in a South African context, what might that begin to look like? Considering with what Amanda was saying about the RU reference ladies, they got expelled, and there were no female lawyers out there for them. There were no lecturers who stood up for them. Those girls got expelled. Their academic careers are over. The men graduated, and it's all done. We've all forgotten. So what does that is militant. What they did was militant. So what does it look like in a South African context where it doesn't cost you physically, or is the cost what you have to pay? Is it the price we have to pay for what we believe in?
Thank you, Philabi. Ma'am, I have you.
What about, you talked about how women will slut shame other women for being promiscuous, but what if, say, I have a friend who really wants to be a housewife. What if she gets shamed for that? Like, what about the reverse?
Thank you, ma'am. What's your name?
Sarah.
Sarah, thank you. I'm going to ask the panelists, anybody who wants to answer. The first question from Philabi is, what about the girls who protested against rape and we didn't help them?
The price they paid, yeah.
Sure.
That's a very
Wait.
difficult one,
Yes.
because for me, when that moment in time happened, it gave me a tremendous sense of hope that in this younger generation of more militant women, we were seeing what it looks like to not sit back and to radically take action. But as you so very clearly and eloquently point out, that there are very real consequences for that. So there are parameters within which that can happen. But when I use the word militancy, I guess I'm posing a question to engaging and thinking about what might that mean and what are the different forms that can take. Because for me, it certainly no longer is a reliance, for example, on a women's ministry to be our savior and to magically take us into a state where we're living in a progressive society, where we have less gender-based violence, for example. So unfortunately, the discourse of the state is centered largely around those failed instruments, that these are the institutional mechanisms, you've got your thing now, and so we've done good by you, and that's not working. So how do we open up these conversations to think about what might a different kind of narrative look like, and what is the sorts of action that need to feed into an alternative vision for a future, where, as Ashanti says, we're not having the same conversations.
Yeah, but can I also just try on that? I think that also speaks to the crisis of leadership we have in our country now, because at the end of the day, you're on your own. Nobody cares about you in the big bad world. Like, nobody cares. Like, if you're going to protest and you're going to take the consequence, you're going to be the only one there getting arrested. No one's going to be there for you at the end of the day. That's the first thing. So the world doesn't care. So two, knowing that those are the potential consequences, are you still willing to have the courage of your conviction? Are you still willing to stand up and say that this is wrong, this is not working for me or for us, and I'm being abused here and violated, and something needs to change? Like, that is where, for me, I think we need to have the conversations, because after all that has happened, we have a lot of people that don't want to participate anymore. Nobody wants to change the system anymore because you're too scared. Yeah, you're going to choose comfort and comfortability over all of that. So that is where the conversation about leadership needs to begin. Are you still willing to have the courage of your convictions, regardless of the consequences? Are you still willing to stand up and say, this is wrong and this is what I'm standing for and these are my values and this is where I want to go, regardless of the fact that there might be some hella pushback and your life is going to change based on that pushback?
But can I
Thank
say
you.
something about institutional cultures? Because I think this is something about institutional cultures at universities, right? There were allies, women allies, lecturers in those contexts. But women have so little power in institutional cultures that it really doesn't make that much of a difference. Combine that with neoliberal management that really bureaucratized and sort of have a technocratic way of managing universities. You run into a brick wall. So it's also about how do we change those institutional cultures. And I've been in a university my entire career, and the thing is, it's getting harder. It's not getting easier. The more gains women make, the more barriers the patriarchal system invents. I think that's...
Thank you. I must say, though, that, Paladi, you leaving us with a big question around what's the way forward. I think with the fees must fall, when the same question was asked to me a few months ago at the University of Stellenbosch, my response was, let's engage and see whether we can find solutions. Because the questions that were raised were valid, that in the heat of passion, in the heat of anger, in the heat of frustration, people did things that they were not supposed to do. Is there room to discuss that? And now the students are engaging with the president and they're engaging with the Minister of Justice. And there is an understanding that when people are angry and frustrated, violence becomes the language of the disempowered. And it might appear that some of these women that were extremely frustrated about rape on campus and feeling that officialdom was not responding appropriately, they may have crossed the line. What I would say is, if you know people who need help, who need their issues renegotiated, let's consider that. I know, for example, that at Rhodes, the rapist is supposedly got a better deal than the woman that protested against the rape, and it's something that we must consider. And I'm happy to be part of a process that looks at taking that forward and renegotiating. Thank you. Sarah's question was, what about women?
Oh, you shame women that have that
women
display
shaming
their-
other women, yes.
that want to be housewives. I mean, look, this is a thing about how we are as people. We have forgotten how to human. We don't engage with each other with respect anymore. We don't see each other. We don't recognize each other. Nobody cares about anyone else. Yeah. And so this is the question that we're raising, that how we need to begin to be more intentional with how we engage with one another. We need to become more thoughtful and conscious with the energies that you allow in and the energies that you're putting out with your time and with your words, right?
Super. I want to ask you guys a specific question about how can we use your book to conscientize women. In one of the chapters, you say a woman's place. I think you quote Star Wars. I think one of the authors called Star Wars, and a woman's place is in the resistance. But
Julia
also,
Clausen's.
yes, but also it's been said, one of the posters we had in the 80s was a woman's place is wherever she chooses to be, which speaks to the question of Sarah. If a woman
about
chooses
choice.
to be a housewife, isn't that fine? Shouldn't we rather find a way to make sure that society respects being a housewife as much as it respects any other choice that human beings want to make?
I mean, I think Sarah raises a very important issue, and certainly it is about choice and being the navigator of our own destinies. But at the same time, we have to be also very conscious that we are socialized within a gendered social order. So for example, my grandmother, who I loved and adored, came from a very particular way of being socialized, was very Christian, was very against divorce, was very against having sex before marriage. It doesn't mean that because those were the choices that she made and was conditioned to make because of a gendered social order, that they necessarily the best ways of living our best lives. And I remember very specifically, you know, her in love campaigning to hold marriages intact that were clearly destructive and at times violent on the side. And so we've got to have that lens of looking within ourselves and saying, to what extent is this my choice, and to what extent am I also conditioned to make certain choices? So as long as there's that constant reflexive, analytical thing going on in our own heads about what governs how we live our lives.
Thank you. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to say, I really think this notion that it's feminists who are bashing housewives for being housewives, that feels like a really outdated, I don't know, like the 80s plot point to me. I don't see anyone doing that. I think the problem is that society is not rewarding women for being housewives, that childcare, that kind of labor at home is completely unpaid, disrespected. We see it all the time in aspects from maternity policies and so forth, the fact that men often think it's beneath them to take on that kind of work. For me, I think we should be looking at those aspects rather than the idea that feminists are like, oh, you're not wearing a power suit, you're so oppressed. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I'd like to think that we are a bit beyond that.
Fantastic. We are running into the last 15 minutes of our time. I'm going to ask if you have anything to add. Amanda, do add, but as you're doing so, will you also answer Catherine's question around the dating app, if you do have any answer at all?
I can take that.
I know it's young people who are more into that.
Amanda's a dating expert. She's
Dating
good
app
at this.
expert,
Yeah.
I am the social media dinosaur, so don't ask me about it.
Yeah.
Now, I think that, you know, the point that Joy makes is a very important one. It is about structural issues. And as long as we can't see that sexism, like racism, is a structural issue, where power resides in places where women have very little power to really change things. So as long as we can't understand that, we are going to struggle. And this comes back to this issue of bashing housewives. It is about choices, but very often those choices are very constricted because of the fact that, you know, we would like to see as feminists a whole array of choices, but sometimes that's not possible. So we need to understand that power is structural and that patriarchy creates hierarchies, which positions us all in very different ways. And that's why intersectional feminism is so important, you know, the intersections of race, class, gender, ability, all of that. And I think if the hashtag, you know, roads must fall, fees must fall, have taught us anything, is that we need to think about feminism as intersectional. And that, immediately if you start to think about that, you can see how power positions people very differently. But feminism in itself is about choice. So whether you choose to be a housewife or choose to be something else, you should be able to do that. But I think, Ashanti, you can speak to the dating app.
Dude, you know, Tinder must fall. That's what must happen. Tinder must fall. Yeah, no, look, dating apps are a violent space for women because it's a meat market. Like, that's what it is. It's a meat market. It's like, oh, I don't like what you look, I don't like your boobs. Like, I mean, there's nothing deeper than that. I mean, you're lucky if you're able to have a Tinder match and meet someone that's an actual genuine person that wants to have a genuine, open conversation, engagement with you, rather than just like, you know, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. So, no, Tinder must fall. Dating apps need to... And I think it also just... You know, it takes away our ability to have like genuine connection with the human. I don't know if that makes sense. I think it takes away because everything's like, so the banter that happens online, and then you bring that in person. If that continues in person, then we're good. You're in business, yeah. But if not, then I think it's a bit of an issue. But to speak to the other comment you made about how a lot of people say feminists are shit, I think a lot of people misunderstand what it means to be a feminist. Like that I'm sitting up here as a feminist writer, best believe somebody put the label on me. I never said, hey, Shanti's a feminist, hey, pick me. That's not what happened. It's simply because of the praxis and the values that I issue and how I live my life. So when we talk about intersectionality, intersectional feminist is more than just a complicated identity politics. It's about your praxis. So more than just knowing your positionality that I am a privileged black girl from Johannesburg, do I live in a manner that is coherent, that is congruent with my knowing, right? So it's one thing to know and see injustice, a completely different thing to now want to try and, fix that injustice.
Thank you.
Can I just say, Catherine, in answer to your question, which I loved, about peer reviews on dating apps. First of all, this was a plot line in the most recent season of The Good Fight, which if you aren't watching, I highly recommend. Women-driven legal drama. And what happened in that situation is that all the men who were rated badly sued for defamation, and the site went bankrupt, which is, I imagine is what would happen. But the second point was that China, you might be aware, has introduced a citizens rating.
Black Mirror.
Which is, it's similar to what was originally portrayed on Black Mirror, but it's real, which is effectively your Uber rating for life. So you have your credit score, and it gives you a mark out of 10, and based on that, you're allowed to apply your kids for school early, or et cetera. And so I think, in general, though I love the concept, we should be wary, I think, about the notion of reducing people's humanities to scores in a wider context.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Unfortunately, with the fourth industrial revolution and the fifth industrial revolution, a digitalized life is going to be part of our lives. Back to you. Can I have at least 2 more questions? Yes, ma'am. And another person at the back.
Hi, I'm Beatrice Market. I have a question.
Beatrice?
Yes.
Right.
What about the men?
What about them?
This isn't a fight that's been quite alone. I've been a feminist for a very long time. But the problem is that whenever we talk about this, it's a group of women telling each other stuff that we need to know, that we already know, that stuff that we share our experiences.
Preaching to the choir.
And it's so valuable if you don't have a support space, which is the main set part. But it's not us that are the problem, or it is the challenge. So how do we include men in this narrative, and how do we empower them to also, because I think there's such a fear about what this feminist movement means for men and their privileges. How do we empower them and make them feel less scared and included and part of our narrative? I thought I was talking a lot louder than that.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Beatrice. Can we have the next one?
Hi, I'm Shirley,
Anyone can answer.
and I'm in a university setting, and I want to know, how do you protect other women without putting them in danger? And I'll give a very specific example, because I think I won't name names because of the legalities, but I know of a 33-year-old man that I work with who last year had a sexual relationship with a 17-year-old student. Now, technically, the child consented, but it's a child. They can't consent, right? How do you deal with that power structure where I now can be able to make the department aware that this is something that this man is doing with these students that we're supposed to be looking after? Like, these kids, they come here, and I get the feeling that he felt that it was consensual because she was in love with him. But the thing is, these kids just idolize us, and sometimes these kids just look at you and they think, oh, you're an engineer who came from a village somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Limpopo. Like, they just idolize us, like, and that gets conflated with, I think, feelings that could be seen as maybe romantic, whatever. But like, that child, I don't know how to make the department aware of what's happening without dragging these kids into a whole mess. Like, how do we deal with these kinds of power structures where I'm aware of something that's happening that's really bad, but I don't know how to deal with it on my own?
What's your name, ma'am?
Shoki.
Shoki, is there a fraternizing policy? Or is there a policy at your university about staff having relationships with students?
See, that's the thing. Even if there is a policy or there isn't one, the thing is, this is a 17-year-old and a 33-year-old man. Like, that's my issue. This child, it's a child. they cannot
Okay.
consent.
Can I say?
All right, thank you, Shaki. Amanda is going to answer the question.
Well, I mean, if you have a policy, the policy makes very clear what is sexual harassment. So that falls within the spectrum of what can be considered sexual harassment. So anyone can make a grievance procedure then, but you have to have a policy and a grievance procedure. I mean, strictly speaking, that's statutory rape, right? I don't know, is it under 16?
No,
or
no,
is it
it
under
should be
16?
below 16,
Yeah,
yes.
below 16, all right, so it's not that. But, I mean, it falls within because there's a power relationship, right? And whenever there's a power relationship, it can be construed as sexual harassment. And then, therefore, if you have a policy and a grievance procedure, it's not impossible to deal with it.
Right, thank you. Anybody else who wants to answer that question on whether this can be construed as sexual harassment? But two, also, what are the strategies or a tactic that Shoki can use to help the child without necessarily exposing the child?
Sure. I mean, I don't know. The first step is like, does she want to report him? Is that something that she's trying to do? Or is this you?
No, the child doesn't want to report. She doesn't know that she's being abused, according to Shoki.
Yeah.
She's 17.
Look, I've had very not so good experiences with the policies and trying to report people within a university setting. I mean, the first thing, I'd go to the police. Like, I'm not trying to even deal with the... You are more likely to get expelled for plagiarism at university than you are for rape, okay? So, like, I don't know, girl.
Right.
Sure.
Joy, do you want to take this? Because your paper talks a little bit about, misogyny, abuse of women's bodies by people in authority. You talk a little bit about your gynecologist, your doctor when you were young.
Yes, I mean, it's a very hard one, and
Yes.
I'll answer it very briefly by linking it to my story. So my story is about being 9 years old and being sick and having my mom take me to a white doctor in the southern suburbs. And he examined me and he said that he needed to do a thorough job and then proceeded to sexually violate me. And in my childhood innocence, I thought that he was looking for viruses, that he was doing his job, because I'd been socialized in a way where the system worked in a particular way and white men of the patriarchy had authority, established authority. I did not have the terms of reference to question how those things worked. It was only many years later, as a feminist, that I had the analytical tools to look back at that experience as an act of sexual violence and seeing it happening within the context of very skewed power relations. And so Amanda's argument about how, while it may well appear to be consensual, but it's happening within this framework of power relationships that are not equalized is a very important one. And how do we take that on? Because essentially this person is 17 while legally, is able to make a decision. There is this context of skewed power relationships.
So, thank you. Thank you, Joy. I think the answer is
We don't have
perhaps.
I think
We have
it's also
questions.
just like, the power dynamic that comes with being on a panel discussion. Like, you're all sitting there looking at us, like, wanting to give you answers. Like, that's, we're not, at least me here, this
I have
one,
no answers
I'm
to
not an
anything.
expert.
I know nothing.
Okay, the rest of them, yes, experts. But it's like, we don't have all the answers. And this is the thing, the starting points that we need to be able to engage with each other openly, honestly, like, as equals, to have the difficult conversations and try figure out what is the way forward if this is the case.
Can I also say, I mean, honestly, I feel uncomfortable about this question because another fundamental tenet of feminism is that we grant women agency, and it's a very complicated line here when you have 17-year-old who's above the age of consent, who's not asking you in any way to intervene in the situation, and another tenet of, human rights and justice is that it should be victim-driven, it should be survivor-driven, it should be in line with the wishes of the person allegedly being abused. So I'm just saying It's definitely not a clear-cut question at all. in my
Sure.
mind.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. But we go back to the question that was raised by your two colleagues about structural inequality, systemic, patriarchy and gender inequality. That on the one hand, you say on the face of it, legally, she is consenting and legally she's supposed to know what she's doing. But in the same way as we spoke about the woman who chooses to be a housewife, who is saying, I think Amanda was saying, she needs to be placed in a position where she needs to know what other options does she have. So what I would have said is perhaps running a workshop for girls at your university, just talking generally about their rights, responsibilities, and the whole notion of blessers and things like that could just help girls reach a moment of decision on their own about whether they want to continue with these relationships. Yes, some relationships may last for life, but others may just be about, as she said, idolizing, and sometimes even a little bit monetary. Yes.
There was a question about
what about the men?
Yes, that was the question by Shoki.
Beatrice.
No, sorry, Beatrix. What about the men? How do we bring them to the party and make sure that they're partners in walking towards this journey that embraces everyone's humanity? Anyone who wants to take a bite at it? Amanda?
I have a dual response to that. The radical feminist in me says, why should I educate men? It would be like white people saying, well, let's educate white people. White people have had centuries to educate themselves, right? But that, I guess, is not the answer, because we need men on board and we need men as allies. So I often look at the Take Back the Night marches and the anti-rape marches, and then there are not many men. So where is the willingness to also see that they are part of the problem, right?
So I want to share a story that speaks to exactly that. So I was on a panel a few weeks ago at Stellenbosch, and the theme was women empowerment, and it was a room full of mostly female students, and there was this really cute white boy that got so angry. Yo, man's got so red. Yo, it was Roy. Gets up and you could see he couldn't even articulate himself. He was just like, this is why you don't see men in the room. Like, there's a strong anti-man sentiment, and you're just all on here, men ain't shit, whatever, And the point for me that I made in response to his, many what about us nice guys that don't do this shit? I'm not shit. Not all men are shit, right? So to the men that think they aren't shit, the not all men, those guys. You are the ones. You are the ones that are supposed to be calling out your guy friends when they're making sexist jokes. You are the ones that are supposed to be doing the ally work for us. You are the ones that are supposed to be calling out your peers, not us. That is where the work is supposed to. You are the ones, that anger that boy felt, I said, but that's the point. As women, we are conditioned to behave and protect ourselves as if every man is a potential threat. That is how you walk down the road. You will cross the road if you see every guy is a potential threat. And if that upsets you as a man that is not all men, if that upsets you, then do something about it. You are the ones that are supposed to be holding people accountable. And so it's that anger that they must use to do the things, honestly.
Thank you, Ashanti. Joy, did you want to add something to this dialogue about men?
Unfortunately not, but I do, I'm very conscious of the fact that we're running out of time, and I want to do a sales pitch because Uta, our fantastic publisher from Mbali, is in the house, and this will make her very happy. The book is on sale after, and it really is, Amanda and I talk about it as being a labor of love. It's been a special collection to put together. When you have a look at it, you'll see that a very dear friend, Adam Carnegie, did each essay is illustrated by a piece of artwork. And his process was a very deeply reflexive one, where he read those essays and internalized them and came up with a visual conduit that was the angle into each story. So it is a very special collection of artistic enterprise, and we're very proud of it, and we're hoping that you... Now we can go back to the men, now that I've done the...
Joy, you've just said something about a man who actually helped understand the
There's
vision.
our ally, Adam. Go, Adam. And can I just say that he, when I approached him to do this, he initially was like, I'm not sure that I can do justice and that I'm the right person. And that was, it was an analytical, emotional engagement with, is it right for him to do? And just having a man be emotionally that mature to have that response is quite something. Thank you, Adam.
And can we say also that the proceeds of the book goes towards the Women's Legal Center?
Super. We really have run out of time. Do you have one quick question, ma'am?
Up there.
Okay. Do I have the power to have one quick question? Okay, I'm sorry, ma'am. I have to
Is
go
it a
up
guy?
there.
It's a guy.
Okay, a guy then.
Go.
Which one?
There, the white.
Okay, sir. You have the floor, sir, or you have the roof, sir.
Loud. I don't have a microphone, but I just came from the United States for work-related travel, and I wanted to have like a two-part question and one comment.
Chief. Chief.
One question.
You have one minute, sir. 1 minute, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
So with the legal age to consent in the United States is 18 years old. Anything below that, you're going to jail. So has there been an initiative to push to raise the legal age of consent here?
No, we haven't.
I think that's a really good place to start to advocate, just in my opinion. Because that way it's
Wasn't that with the Customary Marriages Act? That was an issue with the Customary Marriage.
Well,
And then another question / comment is, how difficult is it for women in the workplace, especially women of color or minorities, to get jobs when you have your boss soliciting sex in order to get the job? I noticed that with my family in Nigeria and friends here in Africa, it's a big deal. And it's almost like if you don't do this, you won't get the job. But,
Big deal in
the United
America
States,
too.
Human resources take the issue is that here and what can be done to eradicate that?
thank you, sir. And thank you for bringing us into the workplace as well. We didn't have enough time to talk about experiences in the workplace, but the book does talk about experiences in the workplace. And one of the assertions that are made in the book is that women are more closely scrutinized for the top job, for any position of power. Do you want to talk to that, Amanda? Or do you
Julie,
wanna
could
say
we
something?
ask you to maybe talk to that?
Well, I guess,
What are your thoughts on the book?
actually, my just quick answer is, in my case, it was interesting, was because at the time I took the position, it wasn't seen as a position with enormous power. The scrutiny was not that thorough. I mean, at some stage I was even asked, "You're too nice, I mean, for this job, do you think you can do it?" But a lot of the questions were just about, Gogo Dlamini stories. Are you going to be able to help them? Are you going to talk to people via the radio and things like that? Not the hard questions. It was only when we started to do serious investigations that the hard questions started, including whether or not I deserved my salary. 2 men had the same salary before me, but suddenly a question was raised about, should you have the salary? And one of the MPs even said that if it wasn't legally permissible to reduce my salary, he would be requesting that my salary be reduced. And then, of course, I wasn't called a nasty woman, but I was called a spy and many, many other nasty things. But this is not really about me. It is about what the women have written here, and a lot of it starts with the conversation about Hillary Clinton and Trump, but we're looking at parallels here about how far do we scrutinize men? and the extent to which we are prepared to live with mediocrity when it comes to men, but when it's women, even when we see excellence, we hesitate. I think that's what basically they're saying. Do you want to talk to that? Just very quickly.
I think quickly we've seen this abundantly in our political sphere, as you'll no
Yes.
doubt know, Thuli. And I think the best illustration probably still was Lindiwe Mazibuko from the DA, who has become a really outspoken advocate of combating sexism in politics, due in no small part to her treatment, which was really shocking, I think, even by our jaded standards in terms of the focus on her appearance, her weight, her hair, etc. And just the fact that at the time that Lindiwe Mazibuko was ascending in the DA, we had the simultaneous ascent of Julius Malema, and it was so interesting to see the contrast between how those two figures were treated. Malema was the firebrand, he was the rebel, the rabble-rouser, so often spoken about with kind of fear, but with real respect. This man is dangerous, what can he do? Then you have Mazibuko, who's continuously spoken about as uppity, over-ambitious, and we see some of that same discourse around Patricia DeLille as well. In men, ambition is a virtue. In women, ambition means you're a bitch. You're just out to claw everyone out. So I think they're just abundant examples of what we've seen.
And the issue of expressing emotion in the workplace, do you want to talk a little bit to that?
No, I was going to say that the chapter, the chapter by Renee Talliard is titled "Running for Office and Running from Office," and I mean she was the youngest MP in Parliament, and she wrote the book Up in Arms about the weapons scandal and the price she paid for being outspoken and being critical. So I think that chapter really speaks to the issues of being a woman member of Parliament if you're not part of a faction, and what women appealing to her to become part of a faction. Otherwise, she's seen as sort of selling out. Yeah.
Right. Well, what I like about her ending, though, is that she's saying if she knew then what she knows now, she wouldn't have run away from office. If she's confronted with similar issues in the future, she would stay because somebody does need to stay. Well, unfortunately, we still have one question. All right, one last question. You have your hand up, ma'am. You have the last word then. Yes, ma'am, over there.
Oh, we've got one standing.
Thank you. It's pertinent that Joy brought up being 9 years old when this happened and what was happening around her. And when I ran this evening to come here tonight, my 9-year-old was like, "Where are you going?" And I was trying to explain this in a very simple and kind way. And he was like, "So am I also allowed to call myself a feminist?" And I think it brings us down to reflecting what Ashanti was talking about. What is our practice? What is our values? Are we allowed to, who labels us as feminists? And this is what's empowering, and I think it's so important that as women and as nurturers, we really reflect that. Are we raising our children in equality? Do we treat each other equally? That's the central issue, because that's where we need to stand together. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Anybody who wants to respond to that before we
One more
close?
question from the middle.
Oh,
Mike.
can we take one more question? Yes. All
She
right.
had a mic.
Okay, over to you, ma'am. Sorry, I didn't see.
Actually, that's partly my question. I struggle with what feminism is. When you started, you mentioned a person like, was it Charlotte Maxake? But
Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
thinking about a person like Dr. Ellen Kuzwayo, who I suspect you know very well, right?
Yes, I
I
do.
mean, if you have people like Dr. Ellen Kuzwayo, Dr. Oshadi Pakati, I mean, they didn't call themselves feminists, but they empowered women to be who they were. So I struggle with, I'm a feminist, so this is what I do, this is what I think. Because I'm who I am because of how my mom empowered me. And she's never
100%.
called herself a feminist.
100%.
But we are all equal in my home. We have one brother.
Yeah.
So I struggle with, in fact, even the title of your book, I'm not sure what how to relate it. I haven't read the book. I hear now there's something about Renata Lert, and I like her, so maybe I'll buy the book. But I don't know what the book is about. So basically, even your self-speech wasn't convincing, Joy. So I need something to go home with, you know?
Sure. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. What's the name, ma'am? Debu. Ma'am Debu. And what was your name there, ma'am? Jenny. Right, thank you. Can we have two answers? The first one maybe we could start with this one. They're interrelated about the use of the term feminists. And
I mean,
add to it, should we call women who believe in women's equality feminists if they don't do so, if they don't call
I don't
themselves
think it's
feminists?
about embracing the label. You don't have to embrace the label, but it is about what you believe, and it's about believing that men and women are equal. That's basically the bottom line. So there are many different types of feminism. There's not only one feminism.
So
But
what do
I
we say
think-
to the 9-year-old?
Yes, he can
Who's
be a
asking,
feminist.
should she be called a feminist?
Feminist. If it's a boy or a girl, can be feminist. If they believe that men and women are equal. And yeah.
but can I also just maybe try with the question about the label feminist? Like me, it took me a while to accept the label feminist because that's what people kept describing me as. And I was just like, but I don't remember at any point saying, yeah, no, I'm a feminist and therefore I'm going to write like this, so I'm going to have these views because, you know, I don't remember doing that at all. So I think for me, it also comes with the having learned the language, like to be able to speak intersectionality and to wax lyrical about white supremacy and all these things. Like I had to learn these things, right? I had to like read, I had to read Fanon and like learn all of these terms. But before I learned the terms, we were still talking about the same issues, but just using different language. Or as well, you know, English. You know, like it's a colonial language. These are colonial things that we're trying to unpack. So it is, for me, what you're speaking to also speaks to the issue of language. How do you dismantle the master's house using the master's tools?
Right. Thank you, Ashanti. Right. Joy, do you have
Maybe just very briefly.
some wisdom?
I don't know about wisdom, but very briefly to say that I don't think that we want to force this label feminist on anyone. But here's the thing, that if you believe in creating a different kind of society for our boys and our girls, for creating a society that is just and equitable with a human rights framework, where we live that in real ways, it's not just a piece of paper, then you're feminist. And if you don't like the label, no, don't own it. But if you are actively trying to take up issues of inequity, that because of how we are gendered makes some people more equal than others, then you're feminist. And it's not a terrible thing. It's not a swear word. It is about appropriating words that society have taught us are uncomfortable and nasty and that we don't want any attachment with. Claim them, take them on. Who says it's a bad word? Who says being a nasty woman is a bad word? If that is about claiming agency in the world, if that has made me see that having some white man touch me when I was 9 years old and it makes me live a life that challenges all those things, then I'm nasty and I'm feminist and I'm proud of it. So.
Rebecca?
I really don't think I
You don't have any words.
must go home.
Well, any closing remarks from your
Yeah,
side?
I think I absolutely agree with Joy, and I think the one thing that we do as feminists is we expose power relationships. You know, it is about naming those power relationships and see how we can undo them.
Right. At this stage, I would like to thank our panelists for a fantastic book, for a thought-provoking conversation, and for sharing vast amounts of wisdom. It seems to me that this is the start of a conversation around what's happening in the world, the kind of values that are currently influencing who we choose to place in positions of power, the kinds of values that influence how we relate in the workplace, how we judge women, how we decide who we place in these high positions. It's also the values that influence how we deal with people who have been affected by sexual harassment, by rape, and all sorts of these slow forms of violence, as Amanda speaks about. I hope that tonight is the beginning of a conversation. But my second hope is that the conversation will also talk about different kinds of feminism. We've spoken about feminism as if there's one strand of feminism. And one of the reasons people get attacked about feminism is because it's assumed that every feminist believes that men are inferior and women are superior, because there are feminists who believe that. And there are also feminists who believe that women should be able to be as terrible as men. And that's feminist. But then there are those who are saying, no, two wrongs don't make a right. Women should be free to be whoever they want to be, but ultimately we're creating a better world for everyone. I also hope that the conversation will deal with the issue that was raised by one colleague at the back there. How about men? I personally think that the challenge of masculinity in this country deserves a conversation on its own. And I do disagree with you, Ashanti, about men are trash. I think we have a crisis of masculinity. We have men who are trying to find their place in this new world where gender roles are supposed to be redefined. And if we're not helping them to come to the new world, we will face a backlash. In America, they did face a backlash. One of the books I read in when I was still a student was a book by Susan Faludi, The Backlash. And we need, I think, the rise in femicide in our country and all sorts of violence against women from cradle to grave, literally, may have something to do with the crisis of masculinity. And I do think we need to have those conversations. But lastly, to also remember that a lot of the strides we've made as women from history have had to do with working with men side by side. If I think of the first wave of feminists overseas, they would have worked with people like John Stuart Mill. If I look at the first wave of feminists in this country who may not have called themselves feminists, as Mamdebu said, but they worked with men, Charlotte Maxeke, Olive Schreiner. The reason women eventually were accepted as attorneys in 1923 was because of a friendship between Jan Smuts and Olive Schreiner. And they made a pact that if I support you in 1, 2, 3, you are going to reverse the decision of lawyers, which lawyers have refused to allow us as women to enter the legal profession, saying we're more suited for the house in terms of our physical structure and demeanor, and which is some of the things that you question around where women are supposed to belong. But I do want to thank these brave women for their audacity to write this book, to kickstart this conversation. And I thank you in advance for buying this book. And using it to have conversations like this, to ask, what does it mean for us, for how we take the South African struggle for shared humanity, shared prosperity forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. But feminism in itself is about choice. So whether you choose to be a housewife or choose to be something else, you should be able to do that.